Hello, viewers. This is Dr. Kamar Chima at the Sanober Institute. And today we are going to have a conversation about this very important topic that is about India-China rapprochement. What would be the Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy? This is a very important topic for us in Pakistan and the region. And I have with me, an excellent panel. With me, I have Ambassador Nagmana Hashmi. She's our former ambassador to China, Belgium, and EU, and she's a board member at the Sanober Institute. And we also requested our dear friend, Mr. Asanga Abayaguna Sekara from Sri Lanka. I hope I have pronounced it well, who is a geopolitical analyst and strategic advisor from Sri Lanka. He's at the present executive director of the South Asia Foresight Network under the Millennium Project in Washington, D.C., USA. He's also the senior fellow at the Millennium Project and the technical advisor to the IMF. He has written book, on teardrop diplomacy, China's Sri Lanka foray, that was published by the Bloomsbury. And so there's a lot which I can speak about him. So before getting into that detail, I want to thank you, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thank you for
So,
inviting us. Yeah.
Thank you, madam, and thank you, Mr. Sangha. So, Mr. Sangha, how would you see this India-China rapprochement, particularly when Americans are coming up with this Indo-Pacific strategy and they needed a partner in the region? In the normal in the street in the street sense, or normally we say that uh, America needs India to counter China, but here is India who is there to manage everything with China. Do you call this India's multi-alignment approach or strategic autonomy approach? How do you see this, and what motivated basically the China to come on table with India? Because many people believe that China has compromised on so many things with India. So, what brought India and China on table and move on by improving relations? How do you see this?
Well, thank you so much for having me with your program. And it's a great honor to have to sort of be in the panel with Your Excellency Ambassador Hashmi. So your question is very important. I've been traveling in Southeast Asia for the last few weeks. I was in Vietnam. Now I'm in Thailand right now. So I'm going to Colombo, then heading back to China in a few weeks' time. So I was capturing basically what the thinking of the region on China and India, and how they carry out the regional diplomacy, how successful those two countries have been in carrying out the regional diplomacy. What I found was very interesting, sort of a trend of data, is that China's economic policy has been tremendously successful in almost all the countries that I've traveled in ASEAN, as well as most of the countries I was in Bangladesh also. So the economic policy, the trade has sort of been very successful. Why India cannot isolate China is because of the trade. If you look at the bilateral trade, it has always increased. Even in 23, 24, the figures, it has crossed more than 100 billion. So India knows very clearly, although they are part of that sort of containment, which you mentioned on the US side, on the Indo-Pacific, or call it the AUKUS or the Quad, which China calls it the regional bloc sort of mentality. Clearly, there is a message that India has understood that you need China. The two big civilizations has sort of, now if you look at Dr. Jayashankar's son's, Dhruva Jayashankar's book, I've been sort of going through that book. And so they're mentioning about the ancient civilization. There's a reference to sort of the ancient culture. This is quite interesting. So both nations are seen as civilizational powers. And what Wang Yi quoted was very interesting. I will quote exactly what he said during when he met Misri, the foreign secretary. He mentioned that it's time for legitimate rights. They talk about legitimate rights and interests of global South. So global South is one of the sort of main key areas that Wang Yi mentioned, that it's time that the global South understands this, and creating that conducive environment for contribution of the two ancient civilizations to peace, stability, and development. and prosperity in Asia and the world. So basically, what they're trying to, what the Chinese projection is sort of very clear from their global civilization initiative, as well as the three initiatives they launched. And India has no other alternative. India needs to sort of to work with China rather than sort of India had sort of they had their border issues and all that. But if you look at from the success now, what they had on January on the flights, restarting the flights, as well as the pilgrimage and various other stuff, the softer side of the diplomacy. I see a tremendous success in both countries working towards, because more they work together, it's better for all the regional countries, like where I'm coming from, Sri Lanka, where we always get into these binary choices as nations. And we are pushed also in many geopolitical as well as the strategic challenges we have. For example, the moratorium the previous government has to declare on the Chinese research vessels. I can clearly mention that. Now the moratorium period is over. When they declared it, I mentioned that how long are you going to do this? I mean, it is ridiculous, because we understood in Washington very clearly those ships, the research vessels, I can clearly mention in this forum, there is no threat from those ships. There is no security threat. Initially, we did see it as a security threat, because India was seeing these research vessels as vessels that was collecting data, as well as sort of doing some sort of espionage. But then there is nothing like that. Even on the Indian Ocean, they were not collecting data for submarine warfare or something like that. So I think India understood this very well now. That is the real problem. So that's the reason that India is working. So I think I'll stop there.
So thank you. So for the initial comments, I will go to Ambassador Nagmana Hashmi. Ambassador, how do you see this India-China rapprochement? Some of the points have been raised by Mr. Asanga. But do you think that the Indians do believe that this is not a time for a competition with China, or this is not a time to get entangled unnecessarily? And also, what brought China on table with India? Because this was not something we could seriously see will happen back in 2020.
Thank you very much. To begin with, I would totally agree with the analysis of Mr. Asanga, because I think everything that he has said uh, is are things that we are also thinking about them, and those are very relevant points that he has raised. So I fully endorse what he is saying. However, to build on or to take it forward from what he said, I have a slightly different perspective on this. Um, as you said, in back in the late 20s, things were still a little different. But after 2019, since China actually became 70 years old, the new Chinese dispensation, and they achieved their first millennium goal of eradication of extreme poverty, and overtook the West in AI and 5G and all. The entire world, including India, realized that this was a different China. It's not the China of 1962. This is not the China of the 70s or the 80s. This is the China that is now on the cusp of actually making it to the finish line, which is 2049, which is rejuvenation of the motherland. And I think especially if you look at the border skirmishes that have happened in the Dolcam region. I was in China at that time. It really changed India's perspective on China, because they realized their own limitations and the strength of the Chinese. As far as the Chinese are concerned, I think they really do not take India on its own as a military threat or a strategic threat, because China is now militarily far superior than the Indians, so that is not an issue. Economically, also, there is no way that India can, in the foreseeable future, see coming anywhere close to the economic development of China. So they've realized their limitations there too. And this continuing tension with Chinese are not in the Indian interest at all. Secondly, yeah, it's slightly controversial. You may disagree with me, but this is how I look at it. Because if you look at where the US and Indian relationship was at its peak when they did the nuclear, program signing and other things, uh, I think that was the peak of their relationship. Over the years, now you see the Americans also realizing how much they can depend on India as far as you know this region is concerned, as far as the um, this Asia Pacific region is concerned. Uh, because we saw how the Indians behaved during the Ukraine crisis. You know how India the US was expecting India to side with them, and yet, despite all their military help and all, they, despite being their strategic partners and being in Quad and this, that, and the other, the Indians took a very independent stance. And I think that is because of their very special relationship with the Russians. And the most significant thing that has made India probably, back down on its very strong stance and has agreed to come to the table is, again, this is not the 50s where the Chinese and the Russians were on a totally different page. Today, the Chinese and the Russians are on the same page. They have the, all weather strategic cooperative partnership for all times and limitless, for anything. So now India has to ask itself if this Indo Pacific strategy is taken forward, particularly in the run up to 2049, and things really become difficult, then I think both the Americans and the Indians are asking themselves this question: where will they find themselves? Will India be willing to actually come into a confrontational situation where on one side they of course have the West and India, and on the other side there is of course China and its own partners and whatever, plus the Russians together. So if they cannot vote against Russia in Ukraine, and despite all the sanctions, are still doing booming business with the Russians, on which, of course, the Americans are not happy. So they do realize that it will become a very difficult situation for them. Secondly, I think the realization is dawning in India that they are slowly and gradually losing their influence, the very strong influence that they had on their immediate neighborhood. Be it Sri Lanka or Maldives or Bangladesh or Nepal. Pakistan, of course, is a strategic partner of China, but the other nations are also slowly and gradually, but surely, trying to depend more and more on the cooperative and helpful attitude and that, this philosophy of win-win cooperation of the Chinese, rather than intimidation and threatening attitudes both of the US and the Indians. In fact, it was very instructive. You must have read that statement. Only read it yesterday, but it was only a couple of days ago when the Singapore Prime Minister said that America is behaving like a land grabber and rent seeker, and it is really alienating and worrying Southeast Asia and the region, because and it is sort of forcing these countries or pushing them more towards China, which seems to be more benign and more, economic cooperation related, rather than, grabbing resources or grabbing land or rent seeking. I think, and for India to be seen so close with the US, it is also getting the same kind of a reputation. So I
Sure.
think it's time for them to think uh, that they need to at least have a working relationship and
Sure.
try and sort of reduce the temperatures a little bit.
Sure. So, coming, Mr. Sangha, to you, how do you see the Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy? I've been listening and hearing that Director of National Intelligence on his first international trip is in the region, in Japan, in Thailand, and in India. But at the same time, looking at an experiment which the European allies are having with the Donald Trump, how do you see this Quad partnership is going to be? Because how the Donald Trump is looking, he says that the allies are burden on the United States economy and United States defense. So, what kind of a posture do you see will be for the Quad or for this American strategy for the Indo-Pacific?
Well, again, a very important question that's already been discussing. Many have been discussing this in Washington also. What's the Indo-Pacific strategy? Is it going to be the 1.0? Chinese, clearly the Indians and the Chinese, they know Trump very well because he has exercised this. He's done his foreign policy in the 1.0. So there's not much of a difference. There's going to be a lot of deals. He likes making deals when it comes to China, when it comes to many, even North Korea, so many countries. So a kind of a deal-making foreign policy, transactional. None of the advisors will be able to sort of see the projections on, because it's very transactional, as well as very aggressive this time. I mean, clearly, a lot of people have mentioned that he's coming in with a lot of aggression, with clear geopolitical sort of. I think the ambassador mentioned on land grabs, as well as quoting the Singapore Prime Minister. Many leaders, even in Southeast Asia, that I spoke with, as well as I interviewed, are seeing this as a kind of a very childish, as well as a kind of they tend to ignore it, actually, honestly, and not taking it very seriously. So knowing Trump. So I think the leaders know Trump really well, more than the scholars, because the reading of Trump by scholars is quite difficult because he's very transactional. You mentioned about Russia, a very important point that you mentioned. I can give you one good example is the Chinese project, the Mattala airport, which is done by China in Sri Lanka, given the management contract to India and Russia. Now, there itself, you have a very good a BRI project given management to India and Russia. So they get together and try to do it. But when I asked the Chinese about it, they were, having a big smile about it, that model. But, it's quite interesting. The Indo-Pacific strategy is going to sort of have, I would see, more sort of shifts to isolation. Countries like Japan, for example, you might work with China more this time. Because if you look at Thailand being an ally of treaty ally of US, the last visit of Thai Prime Minister, which happened a few weeks ago in China, she signed 15 MOUs with the Chinese president. The large amount of sort of the FDI is pumping into these Southeast Asian countries. Sri Lankan president received the largest amount of FDI, 3.7 billion, again a few months ago. So you see successful foreign policy calibration by these countries by themselves. They've become very pragmatic, I would say. Vietnam, for example, having the border with China, I believe they understand very well China. So they want to work with China on trade, economic development. So the Indo-Pacific, the larger context where they are trying to build these land corridors connecting India, Middle East, Europe, nothing has happened. There is nothing
It
in that
won't happen
corridor.
also.
So there, I saw so many. I mean, if you look at the last attack by the Balochistan in Pakistan, as well as many articles on this CPEC, they're not correct. I mean, it's not the whole picture. They're just, bringing these pieces in. I think these countries, what are you going to do with these projects? Now, the problem of Sri Lanka, I mean, clearly I have highlighted in my book, these projects, we have done it. So, for example, Hambantota Port. What are you going to do? I mean, are you going to, you can't close these projects. You have to develop it. Like the ambassador mentioned from 2019, exactly. That's the year that actually China has brought in the high quality development for their BRI. And they did bring in, they improved their processes in Sri Lanka. They have done quite a significant improvement to Belt and Road. This I saw in Cambodia very clearly. How the Cambodian government has been working on improvements of the processes. So many countries are working. I would say the Indo-Pacific strategy will remain, but then Trump's sort of unilateral decisions as well as isolation from the multilateralism will have a significant impact. And that impact will sort of, countries have learned. I think Mike Pompeo was there when Trump's administration, the first administration was in Colombo, when he said that choose us, not them. He clearly mentioned this in our foreign ministry. So it's a kind of a binary choices that we had to face and the challenges. We have gone through that cycle and we have become much cleverer, I think. Most of the countries, I think they're doing it really well.
Yeah, I must agree.
Very
We've had
pragmatic.
our share of that too, and I'm glad
Of
that
course,
we were able to keep the balance and withstand that pressure. So,
Of course, I think I mean many countries are sort of going through it, and India. I think India also needs understood this very well. That's the reason that the reapproachment has come. We need to work with China, and we need to work with Russia too, because they are in Asia, and the Asian market is so important for them. They need to work with them. That's the largest market that they have, and they need to work. So what you see is, I think, recalibration of all these. While Trump is doing his the MAGA project, the Make America Great. When I questioned about the MAGA here, like they were laughing about MAGA because every country wants a MAGA. I mean, they want to make their country great. Which country doesn't want to make their country great? So I think the one of the former foreign ministers of Thailand, when I interviewed him, it was very interesting. Said that we want this place also kind of a MAGA here because we want to make this place great, which is very true. I mean, it's an inward policy which is going to be, and they are going to sort of have this aggressiveness. And the problem here is that I think I will end with this the character of the foreign policy that is very important when it comes to the character of it. What I'm trying to say, the maturity of the how matured are these leaders talking, what is the sort of the maturity of this. So this is very important for a nation like United States, because you cannot speak about taking over Greenland or taking over so
he's
I
getting
think
good answers. So,
so here, China does not have to do much. So a lot of countries have already opened the door here, as welcome China, as well as seeing China as a more sort of a matured, I would say, in their foreign policy. So I'll end there.
Mm. So,
if I
Ambassador
may
Hashmi,
just
how would
add before you ask a
yes,
question, if I just,
जी, जी.
add one sentence. As far as MAGA is concerned, well, they should understand that it's nobody else who destroyed America, they destroyed it themselves. So if they want to make it great again, then they can't make it great by being more bullish and more domineering and by becoming land grabbers. They need another approach. So I'll leave it at that.
So, Ambassador Hashmi, you have been hearing, listening, and talking on this Indo-Pacific since you served in China. So, you have the Chinese perspective with you on this Indo-Pacific. Do you think that the Chinese will be in a comfort zone this time, or they're relaxed, looking this Donald Trump's strategy or Donald Trump's behavior with the allies? How do you see the Chinese are with this mindset that they are fine with India? And they believe that they have their own trade with the ASEAN and other countries, and obviously the Americans can't compete that in trade with the ASEAN. How do you see the Chinese will be looking Indo-Pacific? Are they feeling less threatened in the Trump era?
Uh, well, if you look at the two sessions of the Chinese parliament that just ended, which are one of the most important events in any calendar year, because this is the apex body that decides on the strategies to be followed the next year, and to review what has been happening. You would notice that they have really not focused too much on or reacted in any knee-jerk way to to the rattlings that are emanating from the US, for a very simple reason. They know Trump well. In the first term, they did know he was an unknown commodity, but now they know him, and they know him very, very well. And there is a lot of difference between the China of Trump's first term and the China of Trump's second term. And I think Trump is a sharp man. He's nobody's fool. And he is not a typical politician or a diplomat, but he's a businessman. He actually wants to make deals, as Mr. Sangha also said. And so I don't really see the Chinese being flustered by it. They will wait this period out. And they also understand very well. And I think Mr. Trump is also is very aware of the fact that there's only that much. He may say he's going to impose 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. He knows he cannot do it, because the impact will be starvation in the US, and not in China. Job losses will be in the US and not in China. And if they put 60% tariffs, then when the American governments come close to shut down, then it's China that bails them out. Mr. Sangha would bear me out that last time when they were close to a shutdown, despite what was happening with the Pelosi visit and to Taiwan and everything, the relations were really down in the dumps. But what happened? They had to send their Secretary of State, begging to Beijing to please buy the U.S. Treasury bonds for $8 trillion, so that the government doesn't shut down. And immediately there was a meeting between Biden and Trump, Biden and President Xi, to bring the temperatures down. So Mr. Trump will also realizes that these, China will not be rattled by this. For China, 4 years is nothing. They are now strong enough to actually deflect anything that emanates from the US, because they know that may damage them a little bit, but it'll damage the US and the Europeans and their other partners more than it would damage the Chinese. And secondly, they have this strategic patience, that has been there for generations now. It's a civilizational state. It's not a new state like the Americans. So they can wait things out. If you would recall, when this Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher asked, I think it was Mao Zedong at that time, that how long will China wait for Taiwan to come? It may take 100 years. And the Chinese replied, we can wait 1,000 years for this. So they have the strategic patience to wait things out. And particularly now with their technological superiority, their economic superiority, and they are also very aware that the confrontations that might sort of happen, whether it's in the Asia Pacific or anywhere else, China doesn't have to worry, because these are not going to be military confrontations per se. It's more about communications technology. It is more about AI. It's more about cyber warfare and cyber things. And they really an upper hand. So I think the Chinese are now uh, looking at it from a great vantage point where they
Sure.
have very little to lose. And they can, so I don't think there's going to be any confrontation. Or now the tariffs are from 10 to 20%, but and the Chinese have not really responded to that. And they're focusing, like always, on their own development and, spiking up their domestic consumption and all. And very soon there will be another meeting between before you know it, between Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi. Some, of course, uh,
Sure.
understanding will emerge. So I don't really see that happening. I think the areas that need to worry about Mr. Trump is Europe, particularly,
Mm.
and some of their Southeast Asian friends. Um, the Europeans, like, their president-elect in Germany has said that we cannot depend on America for our security anymore, and Macron is now offering to give Germany nuclear cover. So things are really,
Sure.
these are the countries that need to worry about it more
Mm.
rather than China. So I think China is
Sure.
cool about it.
So, Asanga, while concluding the,
Sorry to say, because if it was flustered, or because and if it was that concerned about what Mr. Trump is doing, it would have been reflected in the outcome of the two sessions. It hasn't been. So I
sure.
think we need
So, while concluding the discussion, Mr. Sanga, how would you see, what is the response of this? In the end, just tell us, how is the response of these Southeast Asian nations? How the ASEAN is looking? This Trump's, he comes up with the tariffs and he comes up with this retaliatory tariffs. How these countries in the region look to the Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy?
Yeah, I would like to I agree with the ambassador's comment on the strategic patience. Uh, China has that, and clearly China has demonstrated that. That's what she mentioned clearly in that session, that they're not been reactive. They won't be reactive. On these unilateral sanctions, as well as all that, I mean, whatever that comes from Trump, they won't react. They will make their sort of regional diplomacy much more stronger economically. They will have sort of stronger strategic investments as well as cooperative initiatives in Southeast Asia. So what I see is that even in Vietnam, what I saw was the investments that they bring into the country from China, as well as many other countries, Thailand and Singapore. Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister, when I met him last year, and he was very clear how important BRI is for Sri Lanka, for Singapore. He mentioned about Singapore and the importance of BRI. So these countries are even speaking about the BRI because they see some sort of progress. They see that there is some progress in their process and improvement. So I see that China is doing a better job in the regional diplomacy than India. India needs to improve its regional diplomacy. There is a strategic sort of, I would say, an absence in the India's regional diplomacy. If you look at the sort of the investments that has come from the neighborhood first policy, FDIs as well as Indian companies, you see like figures like one man, for example, Adani going to Sri Lanka doing wind farms, Adani doing another project. There is one like a person, a reference to one individual. Or China, there's no individuals in Chinese sort of the diplomacy in Southeast Asia. I cannot challenge anyone who, I mean, name few Chinese billionaires who've been to Southeast Asia. No, you can't find it because they're doing a much better sort of I would say a strategic investment landscape. So basically, they have penetrated to the ASEAN very well, and ASEAN trade with China, you can see like how it has grown every year. It's actually more than the trade between the US as well as China. So there is more trade between ASEAN and South Asia. You can't blame the South Asian countries also their alignment with China because like what happened in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan president went there, they received 3.7 billion for an oil refinery. Now, how is the oil refinery is going to function? Obviously, with the Chinese companies coming in as well as they're developing it. So now India, looking at India's investments in Sri Lanka or India's investments in Southeast Asia, they need to increase that. So I didn't see much in my interviews. I can clearly mention on in Vietnam, on the Indian investments in Vietnam, or Indian investments in Southeast Asia. So they need to improve that. They need to increase the as well as the strategic depth. They need to bring in more and inclusive. Some countries have been isolated, like Pakistan. Uh, and so this needs to sort of stop. They need to bring in, see the
Sure.
region in a sort of more broader perspective. Stop.
Sure, thank you. The final word, Ambassador Hashmi, if you can just conclude the discussion, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've had a very fruitful discussion, and as far as I'm concerned, I think this our Sri Lankan colleague and we are all on the same page. That we need to wait and see how things develop. And as far as China is concerned, the Indo-Pacific strategy is not going to work without India in it. And India is increasingly being seen by the Americans themselves as maybe not such a foolproof kind of a partnership where they would come in and listen to whatever the Americans want to do without keeping their own national interests, in mind. And the Indians are increasingly becoming aware of their own limitations and the strength of not only the Chinese, but the Chinese and the Russians put together. And they have now, maybe the realization has kicked in that their acceptance and their dictatorial kind of relationship with the South Asian partner countries and Southeast Asian countries is not really working that well in India's favor now. And China's influence is continuously increasing. And with Mr. Trump, the American, at least in the short term, um, their image and their reliability is shrinking very fast. So the only reliable partner that remains in the region and beyond our region remains China. And I think everybody is beginning to understand that.
Sure.
So we need to also position ourselves accordingly and wait out the Trump administration and eventually try and put our national interests first in deciding
Right.
where we need to be and absolutely avoiding the bloc politics.
Sure. So absolutely, we need to avoid the block politics and we put our national interest in the front. Thank you very much, Mr. Sangha, for your time. I know you're traveling in the region. You found the time for the Sanober Institute, and thank you very much, Ambassador Nagman Hashmi, for the thoughtful ideas you have shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Kima. Thank you.